Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And we are now firmly in Halloween season. Hopefully I will be uploading this video the day before Halloween, certainly in the UK. And so I thought I'd try and get into the spirit at least a little bit by putting on sort of a costume. I am paying homage to one of my favourite characters, Wednesday Addams. What do you think? Have I pulled it off? Let me know in the comment section, and while you're doing that, please do be kind. Also, today's video topic I think is particularly fitting for the season, because today we're going to talk about murder most foul. Arguably the most feared and detested method of murder in all of Tudor England. I want to think about why it did create such horror in people, why it was so feared. I want to look at potential perpetrators, those who were accused, convicted, or even those who confessed to committing this particular act. And also, I want to look at the brutal but inventive way that this crime came to be punished. Today, we're talking about poison. And now I think about it, this outfit is perhaps even more fitting. In Romeo and Juliet, William Shakespeare's eponymous lovesick lad visits an apothecary in order to obtain an unnamed but clearly fast-acting and highly lethal form of poison to kill himself. He wants to visit Juliet in what he believes is her tomb and die beside her. However, a trip to the hedgerow or even the Physic Garden might have been sufficient for poor Romeo. Now, I am going to avoid going into too much detail here, and I certainly won't be providing any recipes for the production of these poisons, because I didn't Google them. That, I think, is probably how you end up on a watch list, and I'm not really up for that. The plants of the hedgerow and the Physic Garden, both in Tudor England and also today, in small doses, when put to the appropriate use, were and are medicinal. However, these self-same plants, when used differently, in different quantities, could also prove fatal. These plants include Belladonna, Nux-Vomica, from which strychnine comes. Certain mushrooms, of course, can prove poisonous. There was also a substance known as ratsbane, which we know better as arsenic. Ratsbane was unsurprisingly the weapon of choice for dealing with vermin. But it could also be repurposed towards a human victim. And it can be distilled from plants, aconite, hellebore and henbane. The plants and toxins I've just discussed, I have no doubt, are just a few examples of the types of plants that could be made into poisons that will be found in hedgerows and Physic Gardens all over Tudor England. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that makes them most scary, particularly for the plants in Physic Gardens, because you have to have the know-how to make them into poison, to make them truly deadly. But if you're making them into medicine, if you have that Physic Garden, you have the skill to transform them. And all too frequently, what is medicine can become poison. If you have the skill to process the plants to make them medicinal, then by increasing dose or altering the way in which you are processing it, you make medicine into poison. The fact that this knowledge seems to be fairly common, the fact that these plants can be found in your own garden, but also in the hedgerow or woodland, makes them democratised. As a means of murder, therefore, poison can be used by anybody and everybody. In the late 1520s, when Henry VIII was looking to extract himself from his first marriage, there was a man who had long ties to his family who put himself in the way of what Henry desired. He was John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, and from the 1490s he had endeared himself to Henry's formidable grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. Eventually, Fisher became her spiritual director. His situation got far stickier, because he chose to act as the advocate for Catherine of Aragon, and, in doing so, to dispute the fact that King Henry had valid fears that his marriage was no longer valid. And he did this in public, at the Blackfriars trial of the marriage in the summer of 1529. Unsurprisingly, this made him into a source of embarrassment and anger for King Henry. And as I think we are all aware, when it comes to Henry VIII, that is a particularly unsafe position to put yourself in. This was not sufficient for him, seemingly, and he would go further. In 1531, John Fisher attempted to foment resistance against the king being recognised as supreme head of the Church of England. Some have suggested that he may have been the one that requested the addition of the phrase "as far as the law of Christ allows." So Henry's title would have read "Supreme Head of the Church of England as far as the law of Christ allows." Whoever made this request was evidently looking for a surreptitious way of adding a loophole for the faithful, so that when, and it would be when, they were asked to swear to the supremacy, they would have a way of effectively crossing their fingers behind their back to save their life. In February 1531, poisoned pottage comes out of the kitchen in Fisher's household. John Fisher had refused food on this occasion and had instead handed it to his household of servants. Importantly, this was not a sign that he had an awareness of the presence of poison. Rather, this act was a result of Fisher's own preference to lead an austere, ascetic way of life. The exact poison that was used is unknown, even it seems to the person who was convicted of doing the poisoning. More on him in a moment. Because in his confession, he claimed to have been tricked into the act. Some accounts have him claiming that he thought he had been given laxatives, that he was going to add to the food as a joke that would come at the expense of his fellow servants. It's worth mentioning that those who heard this story at the time were highly dubious, but perhaps he just had a very perverse sense of humour. The person who provided these alleged laxatives also remained unnamed. Whatever substance was employed, it made many of the servants sick and caused 2 people to die. Unsurprisingly, Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, and/or her father Thomas and brother George were, and for some people still are, suspects in the poisoning of this household. If this poisoning of John Fisher's household did have a mastermind behind it, some unknown paymaster, then as far as I'm concerned, Henry VIII is someone that we should immediately strike off the list as a suspect. Because as he was about to make abundantly clear, Henry VIII held a special distaste for poisoners, and this is something I think that was only compounded by his complete terror of them. Henry's government statute of 1531 made poisoning treason. However, rather than the punishment being beheading, burning, or hanging, drawing and quartering, as it was with all other forms of treason, in the case of poisoners, the punishment would be even more horrific. They were to be boiled to death. On the 5th of April 1531, Fisher's cook, Richard Roos, was publicly boiled to death at Smithfield. An eyewitness reported, quote, "He roared mighty loud, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead. And other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work." I want to be clear that, as far as I'm concerned, the heinousness and violence of this punishment is about the crime it is punishing, rather than being about any residual affection that Henry VIII might have had for John Fisher, despite the fact that this religious advisor had such ties and connections to his family, and had been around it for so long. And I say this because, on the 22nd of June 1535, due to his refusal to acknowledge Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church of England, John Fisher was deemed to be a traitor, and on this date he was beheaded on Tower Hill. There is a record of this punishment being used once more in the reign of Henry VIII. In 1542, one Margaret Davy was also boiled at Smithfield. She had been a servant who was found guilty of poisoning her employer. In addition to these public boilings, poison was also doing the rounds in the rumour mill, because at this time there were some really high-profile allegations of poisoning and/or attempted poisoning being thrown around. And, unsurprisingly, at least as far as I'm concerned, the person getting the blame for this was Anne Boleyn. She was accused of poisoning Catherine of Aragon to death. Following her death at Kimbolton Castle on the 7th of January 1536, Catherine was embalmed. At this time, it was discovered by her embalmer that her heart was blackened, with a large black growth off to one side. Modern thought points to this being a sign of cancer that would be a cause of death. However, in Henrician England, it was thought that it might be a sign of poison. Anne Boleyn's name was whispered in suspicion in connection with this. There were allegations that she intended to poison Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, Mary Tudor. Rumours abounded that Anne would find any opportunity to end her stepdaughter's life, and in this, Anne didn't help herself out, because she had apparently declared that she would seek to prosecute and execute Mary as a traitor for the crime of denying the acts of supremacy and succession. Anne said she would do this if Henry made her regent in his stead. But if Anne was planning a public execution for Mary, would she, logically, also plan a secret assassination? Perhaps. Maybe she wanted to be sure, and so was putting a backup in place. Another figure who was suggested to be a focus for an Anne Boleyn poisoning plot was Henry's son by Bessie Blount, Henry Fitzroy. After Anne's fall, Henry VIII apparently told his son that he, quote, ought to thank God for having escaped that woman, who had planned his, Henry Fitzroy's, death by poison. Clearly, Henry VIII had come to think so poorly of Anne, or at least he needed to find a way to think so poorly of her, that he was connecting her to what he viewed as the most heinous of crimes. Here are the questions that I have. Is poison so feared? And is poisoning so terribly punished because it democratises murder? Monarchs and nobles may take on board, even accept, the risk of death in combat, or even on the block. Could it be that if they are forced to think that those who serve them might have an easy way to dispatch them, that it's just simply too much for them to bear? Could this be because, arguably, the whole thing makes a mockery of the idea of social order and hierarchy? Then, as now, poison is viewed as a woman's weapon. Is it possible that husbands who, according to the thinking of the day, would see themselves as being placed above their wives by divine will, because they were morally, mentally, and physically superior beings, find it especially unsettling that she could exact her revenge with a tool that she might find in the hedgerow or even their own physic garden? And for many housewives, the physic garden was part of her domain. It was her job to make up remedies for her family and perhaps even her wider community. So if she could do that, presumably she also had the skill to make the medicines lethal. The state certainly seemed concerned of such subversion taking place, as they deemed a woman who killed her husband to be guilty of more than murder. And this was the case from 1351 to 1828, when the offence of a wife murdering her husband was an aggravated one, called petty treason. Indeed, until 1790, the prescribed punishment for such a murderous wife was to be burned at the stake, in common with traitors. Of course, if the wife had poisoned her husband in Henry's England, she might be facing boiling. Was the threat of boiling put there because the government, and Henry in particular, was so fearful of the crime? Were they looking for something so extreme that it would put people off from committing it? In 1614, Sir John Coke asserted, quote, "Of all murders, poisoning is the worst and most horrible. 1. Because it is secret. 2. Because it is not to be prevented. 3. Because it is most against nature and therefore most heinous. 4. It is also a cowardly thing." I don't think I'm going out on too much of a limb when I say that if we were to put in place a hierarchy of crime, a league table if you will, that murder is going to be pretty close to the top, as being one of the worst crimes that can be committed and deserving of the worst punishments. But today, we don't specify between types of murder. We don't have one punishment for a poisoner and one punishment for a stabber. But in Henry's England, they're trying to. They are singling out poisoning as, I would argue, being exponentially worse than anything else. And I think we can see that in the way that it's chosen to be punished. Without wishing to be too graphic or too gratuitous, the very thought of taking another person, whatever crime they have committed, while they are alive, and throwing them into boiling water and leaving them there while they die, and doing this in front of a public, an audience who is watching this happen, to me speaks to the idea that poisoning clearly holds a very special place in Henrician England. And I'm just trying to work out why that might be. But what do you think? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. Or you can come and find me over on my social media. I'll be leaving links to my Instagram and Twitter in the description box. Follow me there and we can continue these conversations. I do hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to this channel. And while you're there, hit the notification bell beside the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and that you have a happy and safe Halloween. I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.